So how's it going, Nick?
It's going well. Hanging in there, enjoying the start of the summer.
Yeah, you mentioned that you were at the beach today, right?
I was, yeah. First beach trip in, well, I mean, obviously it's been about a year for me. Last year, I have a kind of a complex pool where I'm at, but it's been closed, doing the social distancing thing, but it was nice to make it out to the beach today.
What are the beaches like right now with the whole social distancing and you know
Water's too
the
cold to
rules?
go in. I mean, I would say like for me, and as far as New Jersey summers go, you want to try to get to the water probably by July, August, September, honestly, are the best times. So the water is a little too cold, but as far as like, I mean, it felt like a typical Saturday, honestly, going out there. We were able to get food, masks on, pick up some things, bring it to the sand. It honestly didn't feel too uncharacteristic, so it was nice.
That's good to hear. I mean, you hear about all these things with the beaches and um, people having to wear masks and the social distancing and how it could affect everything going on. It's good to hear that it's just staying relatively normal. Um, Hold on one second. My screen keeps spazzing out on me here.
No problem. Especially in the Northeast and New Jersey in particular, I mean, we don't have that many. We appreciate our summer season. So
Oh, for sure.
yeah, so I'm glad to see like at least down the shore, it felt good. I mean, everyone seemed to be cooperating, and there wasn't much of an intrusion, I guess, like as far as like some of the new protocols that are in place.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just looking forward to getting back to a place where, like, I crave being able to go out to dinner and, like, just get food that I'm not eating in my home. I know that sounds like a ridiculous and, like, first world problem thing to have going on, but, like, I really miss being able to be social and have it not be like what's the word? A taboo, like
Yeah.
interacting with people and having it not be like, oh my god,
Are
you
you
went
being
and you
responsible right now? I mean, you're with your friends right now. Is that the socially responsible thing to be doing?
right. And it's like, well, actually this is a good tie-in. Which is more socially responsible, my physical health or my mental health? um and I say that lightly, but at the same time, like, I went through, like, end of March, beginning of April, I like once we knew we were in this for the long haul, I actually started to kind of descend into a bit of a depression because, like, I didn't realize it at the time or before this, that I'm more of an extrovert than I give myself credit for, because I tend to um, prefer being around other people as opposed to isolated by myself. And being isolated has been it's been kind of a reflective period for me, because I've learned a lot about my personal preferences as far as the things that I need out of the world. But at the same time, it's also tested me in a way that I wasn't expecting, because you think, oh yeah, love video games, love movies, got a huge setup behind me to, I'm ready to go. And then you find yourself kind of slowly tapering off, not wanting to do any of that stuff and just wanting to see people. Um, so yeah. Now, you're in the psychology field, correct?
Yeah, so a little bit of background. So I got my master's degree in 2012 in marriage and family therapy and clinical social work. So I have been practicing as a psychotherapist for, near 7 years now. I have my own private practice where, I've kind of established my own niche and everything. And I'm third year into my counseling psychology PhD program, where I'm doing a
Wow,
little
that's
more.
fantastic.
Yeah, it's great. I think like it complements well the actual therapy that I practice, because this degree is providing me with a kind of like a research orientation, which is a great thing too. Because on one hand, I do care about, again, like the therapy piece, but I also care about more like those macro level issues. And I think like learning how to do research, conduct statistical measures when it comes to psychology, and kind of how to like write something that's psychometrically sound and think like it's a helpful kind of additional skill to have. So yeah, I am third year into my doctoral program while maintaining my practice. So psychology is a passion of mine, and I enjoy doing it very much.
So how did you land in that world? Like, what, when you had to pick a major for school, or was it, early on, did you know when you were a kid that you wanted to do that, or was it just kind of naturally kind of emerged
It
as
was
time
funny.
went on?
I do believe sometimes the profession chooses you more so than you choose the profession. I kind of took a convoluted route into it because while psychology was my initial major in college, I was actually a business major. I was an economics major as an undergrad. I interned as a financial analyst at Goldman Sachs like long time ago when I was a junior, the summer going into senior year of undergraduate school. And I realized quickly that business was not for me. I didn't feel reward. I didn't feel satisfaction or passion about it. So even though I graduated with an economics degree, I just had a feeling it wasn't going to be in my future. So I actually shifted gears and I was pursuing law. I took the LSAT. My
Oh,
family
wow.
felt that, me being a lawyer just made sense. I guess they saw some abilities there.
Do you
So
like to argue?
yeah, exactly. That's it. I'm from an Italian American family. I guess they saw that I like to speak a lot. I come from a family that talks a lot. I argue my points pretty passionately. So I ended up doing a semester at Seton Hall Law School. And you just know sometimes if a profession is meant for you. And again, I just was not feeling that sense of reward, passion, fulfillment. So I had to question things. And fortunately, I have some family that is in this field. They have private practices. They are therapists. Some have achieved their doctorate degree. So kind of using them as mentors, I was able to realize like I do have real like interest in this area. So I ended up in 2010 kind of pursuing my master's in a field for psychotherapy, more like like specifically. And I have no regrets. And honestly, for the last several years, it's been something that's really piqued my interest, and I feel very much rewarded by doing it.
That's great. I feel like that's something that a lot of people are too afraid to kind of pursue. And they just, they settle into what they went to school for or whatever they're doing, and they just kind of like stick with it, and then they're miserable, which is not great.
I learned
But
by trying. I'm a more experiential learner. So like for me, I had to try things, and you could call it a failure, but I almost call it as an opportunity to learn what really fits my personality. So I know for a fact business wasn't for me. Law wasn't for me. So in some ways, trying those things helped me kind of get on the path for what I felt is truly satisfying.
right. Um, Give me 1 second. I apologize.
Oh, no worries.
Um, so where was I? Yeah, no. So it's interesting that you say that business wasn't for you, but then you end up in your own practice. How do you feel like that's different than running a business in general, or do you?
No, that is interesting, right? Because I think some business skills are required, like entrepreneurial abilities to kind of run your own practice. You have to market, you have to advertise, you have to. I mean, there is obviously a payment structure that has to be in place, but I think it's different when it's like I'm kind of selling myself, if that makes sense, right? Like I'm not trying to sell a product, I'm not trying to sell a service. I mean, the service is myself. So in some respects, I feel confident in my abilities, and I really feel that I provide a good psychotherapeutic service. So the business end of things has not been too difficult to kind of assume that responsibility. I also have great people that I kind of consult with that help me with that, because really my focus is the people I work with, the families I work with, and I just feel such a sense of like just again reward seeing that like I can contribute in that way. And also I feel privileged that these people are entrusting with me like their vulnerabilities and things. Like I mean sometimes it blows my mind that people trust me in that way where they're willing to disclose their personal flaws and faults and demons, and really look to me for assistance. So I can't help but feel just a great sense of gratitude for where I'm at.
That's great. And also the level of like vulnerability that it takes, like going to therapy in general, I feel like in our society is not something that's viewed as normal, when I feel like it should be more normalized. Like I've been in and out of therapy for various reasons over in the past. And I've always kind of viewed it, after I went the first time, because I was depressed, and I had hit a point where my anxiety had gotten to a point where I actually broke out in hives once.
Yeah.
Um, and then ever since then, it kind of shifted my perception on it, where therapy and like going to a professional to kind of work out things in your own mind is more akin to being physically fit, but for your mind. So you go to the gym to make sure that you stay healthy, you keep your blood pressure down, you're physically fit and things like that. And it's a shame that in our world that we don't view psychology as more of the mental version of that, I feel like. Um, but so I'm sorry, I forget if you mentioned your niche. Like who do you focus on?
Um, it might be attributed to my age. I did serve as kind of a school psychologist as well as, a school therapist for many years. So adolescents and families kind of are my niche. I feel like connect well. I establish rapport with youth and adolescents, but I also, I see things from more of like a family and holistic perspective, because in so many different ways, the family does influence so much of what we do. Even in adulthood, our kind of here and now interactions with other people, it kind of comes from a psychodynamic perspective, but so much of what we are is attributed to our early childhood interactions with our loved ones, with our schooling, our peers from school. So I do feel that, as far as adolescents and families are kind of my niche. But Frank, one thing I wanted to add too, you're absolutely right. There is something about, especially in like Western society and this country in particular, where acknowledging kind of our vulnerabilities is almost seen as a weakness. And I think like there is that appearance where we have to appear like we are put together. And I think in some ways seeking therapy in particular almost is like an admission of weakness. And that's almost like unacceptable in society. But I have to say, by and large, I admire the people that come to therapy. I've sought counseling myself. It takes a level of courage to acknowledge your flaws, faults, maybe weaknesses, and seek help. There are so many people that are just walking the streets right now that are, whether they're in denial, they're repressing things, they might need counseling, but they cannot get past the hurdle of seeking it. The people that are in my office, there's a level of bravery and motivation that I just give so much credit to, because those are the people that are willing to work. And those are the people that are really ultimately going to achieve results. It's those people that might be in denial that never come to my office. Those are the ones I'm maybe more concerned about in some respects, because they're living their life maybe depressed, angry, anxious, but they're not seeking help for it because of a variety of reasons. So in many respects, like it's kind of a cultural thing in this country in particular. But you're right, like the acknowledgement of weakness is not necessarily a weakness in and of itself. I think it takes strength to acknowledge where we're lacking, or where we might need help, I should say.
For sure. I mean, you know what? Also, to add to that, one of the things that my therapist said to me when I first started going is that most people, as time goes on, uh, you stack the anxiety on little by little, or the anger on little by little, or the stress on, the depression on. It's not something that a switch just flips and all of a sudden you're like, oh, I'm depressed, or I have anxiety, or this or that. And most of the time she said that what'll happen is, and maybe you can verify or nullify this, that more often than not, what'll happen is you'll just start stacking it on and stacking it on, and your perception of normal just kind of escalates with that until it gets to a point where, for me, it kind of boiled over. And that was like my epiphany, where I'm like, okay, I need to go figure this out because I can't continue on like this. And as time has gone on and my stress levels and anxiety levels have gone down, I'm like, oh, wait a minute. This is what it was like before X, Y, and Z happened, or this started adding up. And before all of the stuff started stacking on top of it. And it's like, I never noticed prior to that it was happening. And I feel like a lot of people don't even acknowledge that they might need it, because of the fact that they don't perceive the incremental increases in whatever would drive them to typically go, or that they could use counseling for.
Hmm. I think in some ways, some people might think there has to be this profound change in one's life that like can then contributes to a depressed episode or a spike in anxiety or a panic attack, for instance. But you're right, there is a cumulative aspect to things. And there's actually been a great book. It's called The Upward Spiral. It's in terms of just like enhancing one's like life satisfaction and happiness. But I like the analogy of spirals, because even a downward spiral, like it contributes to depression, it's not usually a singular event. There's a series
Right.
of events that then maybe alter your perspective, alter your actions, change how, maybe you're behaving. That again, just slowly, maybe quickly, but it kind of descends into maybe a more depressed episode. But it's very rare that a singular event does contribute to that. Sometimes that could be the tipping point, but there's usually, there's factors that are contributing to that maybe weren't addressed previously. So yes, it does kind of happen maybe in an incremental way. And in many respects, it's like recognizing that is sometimes hard to, like maybe it's a little bit at a time. And most people might notice, like, when they do hit that tipping point where there's like some real overt symptoms, that's usually when they do seek help.
So at what point would you say someone should actually start to seek help in general, whether it's, the tipping point, or are there signs that you look for or that you think that people should be cognitive of or conscious of that that when they see, they can kind of recognize, okay, I could probably use a little bit of help here. The same way that you could say, you can go to the gym and stack another 5-pound weight on to help build your strength physically. What are some things that you think are important for people to be conscious of, to recognize maybe I can use a little bit of extra help or an external help to improve my mental well-being?
Yeah, I mean, there is an unfortunate statistic because I provide marital counseling as well. And sometimes it's said that by the time couples seek marital counseling, it's often, I don't want to say too late, but it tends to lead, it's more likely to lead to divorce. And the reason for that is a lot of couples with maybe, issues that were like, had manifested long ago, they kind of go through the motions long, and then usually marital counseling, let's say, is a last ditch effort. So I suggest, like, in some respects, like, especially if you're a couple, for instance, seek counseling beforehand. Like, if any sort of life transition that's significant and maybe unfamiliar to you, I don't see the problem in just expressing anxieties, expressing what you hope to establish, what your goals might be. Because I really think counseling, it seems like psychology in general, it's seen as like a problem focused, like, so what are your issues? Where are you struggling? And let's try to work with that. But in many ways, I think counseling and psychology can also be like a preemptive, preventative measure. Like if you take a new job, if you move geographically to a new location, if you start a new relationship, I think whenever there's an adjustment period or a transition in one's life, I think counseling could really be helpful because it could sort through things before maybe it gets more dire or severe.
You said something that actually, I have a couple friends, meaning a couple that I'm friends with, and they were in marriage counseling for a while because my friend Sam was transitioning from working in corporate America to she was going to be helping her husband more intensively with their business. And they were also, they wanted to work on their own relationship. They wanted to make sure that they were solid before they did something like that. And when they first sat down with their counselor, they said to him, like, does this actually work? And her answer was, if you come to me before you hate each other,
yeah,
I can help you 100% of the time. If you already hate each other, just get up and leave and get a divorce. Because if you're doing it as a last, maybe that's a bit extreme. That's the way that she put it.
I appreciate that therapist's bluntness. Some therapists wouldn't even say that, but honestly, there's some truth to it.
Yeah, and it when she said that, she's like, okay, if you get here before it's too late, like you mentioned, everybody uses it as a last ditch effort. The way that she put it was that it's people will end up there as just to say that I did everything that I could. It's even worse than a last ditch effort. I'm just looking to tick the box so that when we get divorced, I can just say, we tried couples therapy, we tried this, we tried that. And the fact that if both people are actually truly committed to fixing what's going on, or you're coming at it from the perspective that they were going at it, that they wanted to make sure that they were on solid ground before they went into a business relationship with each other beyond the marriage, that it really can make a positive impact rather than just doing damage control. Mm-hmm. Which I thought was pretty powerful. That was actually what kind of prompted me to say, like, hey, maybe I should look at this. And then, of course, right after that, I had the episode where I broke out hives. But it changed my perspective on therapy in general. Um, so I was also curious that once someone's in therapy, what are some things that in your mind can help them really get the most out of it?
Yeah, so get the most out of it. I mean, because there are so many different variables. There's like obviously the clients themselves as well as the therapist. And I've worked with what I do find, and it makes sense, right? Like when people are voluntary, when people are like motivated and seeking counseling, they tend to get more out of it because they want that. It could be anything, like even if you're seeking a personal trainer, if you really want to see results, you might put in the work and the effort to see those results. But I've also worked with a variety of people, whether they're adolescents, whether they're mandated for a variety of reasons that have to seek counseling. Sometimes, like, again, if you're seeking counseling for reasons to like, whether it's because your family wants you to, or if you need to legally, maybe it's part of a protocol, a program that you have to seek a counselor. It could be anger management or maybe, rehab for drugs, for instance. Sometimes the motivation might not always be there. So in order to like see results, I mean, it is a matter of, I guess it's also your willingness to be open, because so many people, I think, in general, want to shield certain things about themselves, certain, again, vulnerabilities or other aspects of themselves. But if you can really be open and honest, I do feel that has the best sort of outcomes in terms of treatment, because it does take a degree of, really introspection, but that willingness to share those things with another in and of itself is kind of therapeutic. I mean, that's the thing about counseling. It's like you do get things out of it from an intervention standpoint. You learn skills, strategies. There's a variety of different, but that variety of different approaches just in that regard. But there's so much to be said about really just the introspection and that self-awareness in terms of like looking at oneself. Because I think a lot of people don't want to look really at themselves. If people have self-esteem or other sort of issues that like might, it's much easier to look outwards and distract oneself and
It's
blame others. Yeah.
sort of like hearing your own voice.
Oh
Like
yeah.
I that was something that I still struggle with. Like when I edit like any of the podcasts, I struggle with hearing my own voice. It's not that like I think I sound stupid or I don't believe in what we're talking about or something like that, but like just the tone of my own voice sounds different than what I expect it to, and it changes my perspective on things. And I think you're right. Like looking in is really, really difficult, you know?
Hmm.
Um, so now in family, and you also mentioned couples counseling too, or marriage counseling as well,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So how do you approach so many different, uh, so many different types of therapy? Like when I think of what an adolescent would need out of therapy versus what a couple would need out of therapy, um, I how do you approach the two differently and still make sure that it, is as comprehensive as I'm sure you make it to be, if that makes
Yeah,
sense?
I mean, there are quite a few different like theoretical orientations to draw from, but you're right. Like with couples versus adolescents, I mean, some people like, I guess not having maybe a singular niche can maybe complicate things, but I also like the variety of challenges and different sort of, just experiences I'm able to get, from a professional standpoint. But again, it kind of starts from uncovering individuals' kind of personal psychology, whether that's personality factors, patterns of behavior, thought processes, emotions, because everyone kind of brings with them a very unique set of like variables, right? And it's just kind of uncovering those things, as well as, by and large, it's funny, like psychology, I love the field, but in a way it uses terminology that there's kind of a common sense alternative in terms of how to explain things. But by and large, when humans get emotional, we act pretty dumb at times. Like emotions complicate things. They evolutionary serve a purpose. Like our emotions are very valuable, but they also complicate things. So in many respects, it's kind of like learning how to work with your emotion. Now, in some respects, whether it's a couple, an adolescent, there's different sort of strategies for that. But in many respects, it's kind of, again, the understanding of what one feels, as well as kind of learning different skills to work with those emotions. And that's where, again, whether it's a couple, whether it's behavioral with terms of like how a couple interacts with one another
Hmm.
versus an adolescent, there's different approaches because you also want to like make it kind of age appropriate as well as situation appropriate. But by and large, there are many different kind of theoretical orientations that are applicable to both situations.
Like what? I'm curious. Like
Well,
so just to preface this,
Mhm.
This field in general is like super interesting to me. I have a very analytical mind, and I like to understand how things work. And I feel like this is the type of field where you get to learn how people function. Um, so I'm very interested in hearing about like the overarching theories um, that kind of apply to everybody that can help kind of lend some or shed some light on why we do the things that we do.
Well, there's competing theories, like, and without getting into this, like, I don't want to bore you into a theory kind of like, lesson.
Bring it on. I mean,
Well, no, there's been different waves in terms of like, I mean, going back to Sigmund Freud, in terms of like unconscious processes, like the id, the superego. But by and large, like from a psychodynamic perspective, it has a lot to do with relationships as well as like kind of how we interact with others in our present day, whether that's our coworkers, our significant others, our friends. There is a relationship to how we were raised, as well as early attachment relationships with our caregivers. And kind of we learn about the world through our families in many respects. Like when we're infants, when we're toddlers, we don't know things, right? You only kind of
right.
you learn a concept about the world based on those early attachment relationships. So I mean, if there's neglect, if there's abuse, let's say in a more severe way, I mean that kind of changes one's total life trajectory in many respects. Now therapy could assist you, but it also does. I mean, it takes a lot of time, and some people, they have to struggle first before they acknowledge I need help. Now, psychodynamic, in many respects, it kind of, from that perspective, it kind of teaches you through relationships with the therapist, let's say, how to kind of work through certain emotions, certain maladaptive ways of interacting with others. So it all starts with, though, with a degree of self-awareness. You have to acknowledge where the problems start. You have to acknowledge the emotions that go with it, and then you can kind of sort through some things. But in many respects, like seeking a therapist is in and of itself just a relationship there, and being kind of opening up and communicating in that way could be very therapeutic and healing. Now, there's another wave of kind of therapy that has to do more with skill building. It's called like cognitive behavioral therapy. It's
Before
very
we get into that, I have a question.
Oh, sure, and that's very effective. It's evidence based. I mean, there's tons of research that supports it, and that more or less it looks at your thoughts. It tries to help you kind of reframe dysfunctional thinking, which then can help your emotions, which then help your behavior, which is helpful. There's dialectical behavioral therapy, which has been shown. Again, it's skill based that helps you learn how to tolerate distress and regulate emotions. So there is a skill based component to therapy, and it could be through breathing techniques, communication techniques, just in terms of how to work with your own thought processes. And that's kind of more of a newer wave of therapy. But I would say also the psychodynamic perspective does kind of look at the past, because the past kind of does inform our present. So
Sure.
most therapists look at both. Like, you can't, if you find a therapist that says I'm only this, and there are those out there, that could be useful, but you also might be limited because so much of it has to be integrated from a variety of perspectives.
Right. So early on, you said that a lot of the things that we do um, are affected by what we when we were adolescents, when we were kids, when we were babies, and we were learning. You mentioned abuse and things like that. How does, in the realm of psychology, we hear all the time about um, two people, let's say, that were in like a horrible situation as a child, and one rises up to become a super uber successful like business person, or they are able to, like, let's say they're raised in extreme poverty or an abuse or something like that, and one uh goes on to be super successful and the other delves into like a life of crime.
Mhm.
From a psychological, or what would be the term, the like a psychology perspective, like what would be the term that we could use for, or the correct term for your world?
Well, just thinking about that, because they've conducted like twin studies, like where
Hmm.
identical twins or fraternal twins were like raised in two different households, and I mean, so basically there's a genetic component. Obviously, I mean, it's the nature versus nurture debate, right? And it
Right.
doesn't really be much of a debate because both kind of are applicable, right? There are some personality traits that are inherent to just genetics, like if you're more of an introvert and extrovert, like some of these things have been proven. If you're more like agreeable versus maybe more neurotic, there are certain traits that are just ingrained in your personality. But absolutely, your childhood experiences kind of unlock your potential for possibly being successful, or possibly, struggling. Um,
Right. So
yeah.
I apologize for cutting you off,
Oh, no
but
worries. Yeah.
so let's say you have two people raised in the same household, the same negative type environment, and and they both end up on the opposite ends of the spectrum. How does that happen if they're theoretically they're raised in the same environment? Like what effect does their personality have on that? Who tends to be the more successful one? Who tends to be the one that flounders or we'll say is less successful? What are the factors that go into, I don't know, maybe that's a general question, but what are the factors that go into that?
Well, I was just talking to somebody. I had a client that came in. I mean, she's probably in her 50s, and she has a younger sister. I mean, this woman was a therapist. I mean, she's seeking therapy. She is a therapist. And I mean, just hearing a little bit about her family of origin, I mean, she had a sister who, going back to high school, was struggling with like a heroin addiction. Meanwhile, she, in high school, valedictorian, I think she was on the cheerleading team, went to college, went to graduate school. So same parents, same like childhood in terms of like the community they were raised in, the peers they were exposed to. But there are so many differences, even from a birth order perspective, like who's older, younger, middle child, as well as how the parents interact with you. Because the same parents might also interact with individuals very differently. And it might be subtle, it might appear subtle, but there are profound differences in how an individual, a child especially, receives those messages. And that does affect the youth. Now, you're right, there is a genetic predisposition aspect to all of this, but so much of it, it's just these subtleties, And it does start with, again, like those attachment relationships with your caregivers, as well as how, and it doesn't have to be just your mother or father. I mean, if you're raised by a grandparent, an aunt, and uncle,
Sure.
those early childhood relationships are, I mean, instrumental. If you're feeling anxiety in adulthood, it's worth exploring. I mean, were you around a parent that might have been very anxious that led you to believe that the world was unsafe, and maybe just being in the company of that individual created some anxiety, or maybe there's other reasons that you were feeling anxious, but it's worth noting. But you're right, like there could be many similar variables, but you have to kind of inspect a little bit further because there's often differences, even if it's the same people that are present, whether it's mother, father, friends.
So what would be like a subtle difference in terms of like the way a parent would interact with, an older child versus a younger child, that could set two people on such different trajectories?
Well, common, like, I mean, there's certain, like, I guess, themes that could be present. An older child, sometimes the terminology is called, it might be parentified. So, like, for instance, if a mother might be suffering from, like, let's say a substance abuse issue, or maybe a mother has depression, could be a father, maybe they bestow certain responsibilities in the older sibling. So the older sibling might have to maybe be a supervisor to the younger sibling. So in some respects, like, I mean, you see this quite often, like they call it a parentified youth, where a child has to assume adult responsibilities much early on in their kind of life trajectory. And just something like that might change their view of the world. Maybe that creates more anxiety in terms of like having to be responsible in a much younger way. It could lead to more maturity, but sometimes there's that double-edged sword of things. Like if you're a youth, let's say at 12 or 13, and you're caring for a younger sibling, and you're helping your mother deal with, like, let's say depression or substance use, it's also quite a bit of like anxiety inherent in that, because again, you have to kind of assume a responsibility that's not age appropriate. So just
Right.
something
Like
like
you
that.
kind of lose your childhood at that point.
Absolutely. And that's a common thing. Like we suggest, like, you want your children to behave like children too. Like they have to have some of that as well. I mean, kind of playing and interacting with peers, that's kind of that's necessary, right? In terms of an adolescent, they have to kind of learn how to function in the world amongst their peers, and through play and through socialization, like that's kind of, that's embedded in that process. But just something like that, like you could have two youths, but one is given more responsibility by a parent while the other might be much younger. And I've seen it where a brother and sister, let's say, could be a year apart chronologically, but maybe the older sibling behaves like another parent. So it might be
Right.
1 year, but it could appear from a developmental standpoint like they're 10 years apart. And it's just interesting, like, and that's all a product of how they were raised and the responsibilities given to one sibling versus the other. Some children are babied, whereas others are like held to a higher standard because maybe their birth order. So there's all these, again, these nuances you really have to kind of inspect, because it does inform how, again, those individuals see the world.
So is there like a specific character set that comes with each specific birth order? Like the oldest, it tends to exhibit these traits, the second tends to exhibit these, and so on?
It's hard. Yeah. I wish that, and that's one of the things with psychology, like a big thing with science is like you want there to be research that is kind of supporting things. But psychology has so many like kind of individual variables. It's been harder to kind of have that kind of body of research that says like this is this and that is that. Not like the medical field where, it's a little bit
Right.
more cut and dry. But there isn't much to be said because, again, it could be so family specific. I mean, there are sometimes that the older sibling might be less mature or less developmentally appropriate, and the younger sibling might assume more of a caretaking responsibility. There are certain themes that emerge, but by and large, there aren't like any rules or like any, I guess, like kind of commonalities that might emerge. It depends on the unique families, but one thing you do see is there's certain patterns that develop based on each individual. Like when you learn about a family story, you can kind of almost, I don't want to say guess, but you can kind of predict some of maybe the difficulties that'll arise.
That makes sense. Now,
A lot of it has to do with, again, it's the relationships. It's your interactions and relationships.
right. So now sticking with like interactions and relationships, and you'd mentioned like kids have to interact with, other kids and be kids. Where do you draw the line? There's a lot of talk now about like how bullying affects kids.
Mhm.
Where do you draw the line between kids just being kids and where it actually becomes detrimental and it is bullying and having a negative impact on, I guess, where do you draw the line between healthy conflict and abuse amongst kids?
No, and that's a good point because the absence of conflict, I think, is problematic. I mean, conflict is inevitable. I think you learn through conflict resolution skills, right? Like, you have to have some periods of difficulty to kind of become more resilient and overcome obstacles. But I would say bullying, again, it's like kind of a pattern. It's like if two children were to have a conflict on a playground, let's say during recess, and it gets a little ugly, but they figure it out, they resolve it, and then you can move forward in a more amicable way. Like, is that bullying? Is that abuse? It's a conflict. But abuse, bullying, there's a pattern. And when things become more pattern based and systematic in that regard, then it could kind of lead to pretty dire outcomes. So that's where you kind of have to intervene. And even with psychology, we have something called the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual. That's where all the disorders are: major depression, generalized anxiety. People
Mhm.
can have similar symptoms, but really the hallmark of whether or not it's a disorder is, does it interfere with your functioning? Like, is it causing impairment of your ability to function? So, a child might be getting roasted by their peers in recess, but if they're still, upbeat, have good friends, doing well in school, that wouldn't maybe constitute an issue. But if somebody is like being, bullied by their peers and it's affecting their like mood and maybe they're isolating and maybe they're struggling in school, then you got an issue. So a lot of it has to do with the symptoms that are being, exhibited as well.
So now with the way that it's affecting them, is there, let's say they're not affected as far as like they're upbeat, they're doing well and things like that, but there's what an outsider might categorize as bullying. How can you tell, is there a way to tell if that's going to affect them later on in life? Let's say it's the same thing where they're getting there's constant conflict, and on one hand they're looking at it as, one kid might be upbeat, and you look at him and he's like everything's great, and the other kid's getting the same thing and not. Is there a correlation between that and later on in life for the one that doesn't exhibit any traits or any impairment?
It's hard to say because, you could theorize that if somebody like kind of represses certain feelings, it might show up later on. But again, you're right. This is where like the personality variables really come into play, as well as like their individual supports and whatnot. Like two kids could be like, experiencing the same levels of, let's say, bullying behaviors or whatever it might be, but they might have very different perspectives, and it might show up later on much differently. It's very hard to say because even that, it's like the bullying might be a contributing factor, but you also have to inspect like what are some other variables at play: family interactions, previous trauma, like what are other things there? Because a singular event will not influence people the same way. It just won't. whether it's a loss, whether it's a trauma, whether it's anything. Like some people, they'll have traumatic experiences that one person might end up, spiraling into a depression. Other people might turn a traumatic experience into maybe a motivating factor that helps them kind of achieve higher things. Like, so that's where it becomes like two individuals. It's very hard to predict at that point. It kind of has to be something more holistic, and you have to look at maybe more variables, as well as kind of, you might have to wait and see how people behave later on in their lives.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's hard to be preventative, I'm sorry, in that way, Like,
yeah, well, I guess that's what I was getting at. Like, is there a way to be proactive and saying like, okay, they're not feeling it now, let's make sure that they don't, and let's get ahead of it, and not in the like coddling way that I feel like a lot of people are very quick to jump to now. I know that maybe I'm a little bit harsh, but I feel like a lot of people are very quick to coddle everybody in their lives in terms of like wanting to avoid conflict, wanting to avoid everything bad, and never struggling. And you see a lot of parents now that never want their kids to have to deal with anything that isn't pleasant. And I feel like that doesn't help them down the road. Like, I feel like our generation has a bad reputation for that, for not wanting to do things, not wanting to deal with like not getting our way and things like that, because so many people were kind of coddled as they were growing up. And I'm going off on a tangent, and I just spaced out on what I was about to say.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, well, one thing I was thinking, like, related to that is in terms of like maybe a preventative measure that's not coddling per se. I also think like there's great services that are in place, like therapeutic for, like, let's say veterans. It used to be so long that people would go away to war and come back, and we used to have terms like they're shell shocked.
Right.
Relatively recently, we call it post-traumatic stress disorder, which, I mean, there's clearly a correlation to seeing certain atrocities overseas or wherever as what that veterans experience. So now they have preventative measures in that they don't necessarily wait for symptoms to develop before they have services in place. A lot of veterans, like if you saw combat or you've been exposed to things, veterans, first responders, law enforcement, they might have to check in with a therapist or psychologist, even just for an evaluation. So I do think, like, is that coddling? Not necessarily. I think it's a way of getting involved early enough where you might be able to help before certain symptoms escalate and intensify. So yeah, I do think that the conflict is necessary, but I also think like offering support and informing individuals of how to seek help if necessary, I think that's important too, because a lot of times things don't get said, or people don't necessarily know the channels to seek help. And I just think like informing youth, informing veterans, informing whoever, there's companies that have, their EAP programs, like employee assistant programs. Like there are things like that people just might not be aware of. And I just think a lot of it is information sharing and just letting people know what exists. So then in the event that something happens, they can seek help.
So what do you think the best way to get that information in front of people is, to make sure that they, know where to go or things like that?
Well, I've worked in high schools before, like, again, as a school psychologist, so I can speak from like the education field. And I think back, I mean, I'm not that much older than some of these individuals, but just in terms of the resources available, like I thought my guidance counselor would help me with college admission. That was it. Nowadays, I mean, they got school therapists, school psychologists, case managers, IEP, like there's just different services. And I think it starts with whether it's an assembly, you have to disseminate information somehow. And I know in high school setting, they do a great job of having assemblies after school programs. Like there's just different, I mean, they have sometimes actually like outpatient counselors that work in a school. So you can like make an appointment and see a therapist in a school. Like, I mean, there are things that
didn't exist a long time.
No,
not even like 10 years ago, that didn't exist. I don't feel like.
I don't think so. But they promote it, because they are sensing, especially nowadays in this culture, especially, with the rising cost of maybe sending certain students like to out of district placements because public school can't assist. Like, I just think there's a need clearly. And I mean, how do you inform those? I think it's through, again, whether it's group meetings, staff meetings, town hall meetings, whatever there might be. I think you just got to emails. I think you have to just let people know, because you'd be surprised how many might take you up on that if again, there's a crisis or there's some stress in one's life.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that it's definitely a great thing now that after hearing that, that more like it's happening earlier, that it's helping to change. I think that that's here after hearing that, it's helping to change the perspective of seeking counseling,
Mhm.
you know? Um, Now, when you were talking about your doctorate and research, um, what type of research are you looking to get into?
I'm looking at, in particular, individuals with attention deficit disorder, hyperactivity disorder. Um, I think, in some respects, not just as a population, there's ADHD is kind of split between those that are more hyperactive and those that are more inattentive. And the inattentive ones, those might be the ones that space out or are more easily distracted. And there tends to be a lot more services available for the hyperactive ones because that's more of like an observable behavior. Like if you have a kid that's acting out, can't sit still, is fidgeting, you just see that much more clearly.
Sure.
Whereas kids that are more on the inattentive side, they kind of slip through the cracks. So a lot of my research is just like, how can we maybe help these students bridge the gap in many respects, as well as kind of like what sort of programs could exist to assist these students in particular? Because a lot of times we're finding these kids who are struggling, who are academically, who are having other issues, maybe with things, but they just like there isn't necessarily services for them because it's just not as apparent. So I'm just trying to assist that kind of population in particular.
So how do you identify that, number one, being that it's not as apparent as the kid that can't sit still or that's fidgeting? How do you identify that number? Excuse me. Number one, and then once you have, what are the differences in the way that you would treat someone like that versus someone who can't sit still?
Well, ADHD is like one of those where, I mean, medication has been proven by and large to be a huge help, but not necessarily. I mean, there are organizational skills, time management skills, other kind of like self regulation skills that can be learned. I mean, it's kind of hard too. It depends on the age of the youth. But you're right, like kind of how to identify the population is part of the problem because they are difficult. Difficult to identify. I would say that kind of goes back to, school has certain measurements, like whether it's your grades, attendance, disciplinary measures. Like there are just certain things that these students might be, they're disproportionately maybe getting certain detentions and suspensions, and maybe these kids are struggling in certain classes academically. Maybe it's not a learning disability. So it kind of starts with those like kind of measurable results. It's hard to kind of spot it early enough. I mean, a parent might be able to notice, but usually it's through school and the difficulties there, whether it's through grades and their attendance and their discipline and their like behavior. That's kind of where it might happen. And from there, it's like, then we might at least have a population to look into. Like, is this an ADHD related issue, or is this something maybe more behavioral or like conduct related? But
So,
yeah,
sorry.
no problem.
How do you spot the difference between that being an ADHD related behavior and, let's say, them just not being interested in a particular, like just not being interested in school?
So there's situation specific things, right? Like if someone's not interested in school, that would be very situation specific to that environment. But like if you're majorly depressed, let's say, you can't necessarily turn. I mean, you can turn it, you can manage it maybe according to scenarios. But ADHD, for instance, like your attention, you have attention issues everywhere. You can't be like, all right, I can focus here and not focus there. A lot of these disorders or just diagnoses, like, I mean, they're all encompassing. Like they affect you throughout different areas of your life. So that's the one thing. Like, is it situation specific? Is this just a boring class, or does this youth really struggle with ADHD? It would show up at home. It would show up in sports teams, extracurriculars with their friends. Again, it's like a behavior that kind of is more transparent in many different areas.
So you
So
would see that everywhere. So
yeah, it'd be more
meaning like,
pervasive. Yeah,
say that again.
it'd be more like pervasive in different areas. And
So like even something like video games or sports, they would just be kind of like into it for a few minutes and then wanting to move on.
And even video games, I mean,
Or
that's tough because that's pretty, I mean, that's like a lot of stimuli. So for an ADHD child, for instance, like, I mean, it hits you with like a lot of different things, but you can even see in like a child's video game playing, like maybe they seem more focused, but you can even see within their playing, there's an inattention, there's kind of like an easily distracted kind of aspect, like even within the game itself, like what they do, maybe
oh,
from part to part, this to this, like constantly seeking different, like, it's very hard for them to maybe stick with like one sort of approach and kind of
Like
go
doing
through
all the side
it.
quests first and then not being able to stick to the main story
Exactly.
as like an example.
Yeah.
Um, Now, with that, video games in particular, do you feel like certain video games are more or less addictive than others?
Um, it's hard to yeah, video games again, it varies by the individual. And honestly, in some respects, video games could be learning opportunities. Like they're very effective games through like a video game format that help with math skills and reading skills, because I mean it has been proven that individual like youth are attracted to these things.
Hmm.
But I don't necessarily think there's a game or a type of game that might lead to kind of maybe more problematic behavior in that regard. But I do think that we can harness video games into a more informative and instructional manner, because it's just funny. Like a child will play a game and you lose a life or you struggle and you start back at the beginning, and like kids have shown more resiliency and motivation in games. Like they might fail but they keep playing, so there's something
Right.
about that. Like because kids in other areas, like if it's school, maybe they fail a test and they're like, to hell with it, I don't want to do school anymore. So there is something about games that just attracts like this resiliency factor, and they've studied that. Like why is it that game like kids are more likely to go through conflict in games and keep playing versus like other areas. So there is some like use to video games in terms of like even just teaching kids.
You know what's interesting about that too? Before we started, we were talking about Fortnite and my aversion to playing that particular game. Um, it's interesting that in a generation that is largely categorized as like participation trophies and all that, that they've flocked to a game where there's one winner, and when
Sure.
you lose, you lose. There's no like you lost that match. And it's interesting to me that they've chosen, so many people have chosen a game that it's not like you keep respawning or you keep getting extra lives. It's like if you lose the round, you have to start from zero and go again. Um, and I feel like there's something to be said about that that no one really wants to acknowledge. Um, I also, what's your take on video games helping like hand-eye coordination and like things like that? Do you think
Well,
that there's any correlation there?
for sure, but also think about Fortnite. You're right. There's like one winner, and you could argue like, what is it about? Like, if you finish in 98th place out of 100, let's say, like, where's the satisfaction? Like, you lose and you can't respawn. But see, that game is clever because even if you lose, you still feel that because there's a dopamine release when you feel a sense of accomplishment. You
Right.
open up little treasure chests, you get different guns and weapons, and like you feel satisfied just playing it because there's like in-game rewards. Like you don't have to be number one. I mean, that feels great. But there's other in-game rewards that make you keep playing. And that's part of the thing about video games. Like there's in-game rewards. There might be checkpoints and things that you can achieve in the game. So it's not a matter of like winning and losing. You also feel good while you're playing it. Yes, you feel frustrated when you lose, but in the process, you might be getting things, gaining a little accomplishments. Maybe just by, I know with Fortnite, like even if you don't win, you can like uncover experience points in different parts of the
Right.
map, or like there's other in-game rewards to kind of make it, because again, if there weren't those, it'd be much more easy to be just like frustrated and just to say to hell with it. And video games too, especially during like a quarantine now, there's a component of just socializing, right? Like because these kids are, a lot of these games are not single player, they're online multiplayer. They're
You're
playing
right.
with their friends, there's teamwork, you're strategizing. So I do think the outlook of video games, where it's like, you're playing 12 hours a day alone in one's basement, not interacting. I think the whole idea of video games has to change. And also just from the vantage point of like, it also could be, it could be an occupation for some. Like video games also could be one's career, whether it's a game developer or a video game player. Like I just think it's a new industry and it has a bad rap in many respects. And it could be abused and it could be
For
overdone
sure.
and lead to
Well,
bad outcomes. But
almost everything can be abused.
right, you're absolutely right. I mean, somebody could be really into physical fitness to the detriment of other things, let's say.
For
Um,
sure.
but yeah, like I do think like there are some pro-social and maybe benefits to video games that sometimes get overlooked.
What about things like virtual reality? It's kind of like a bleeding edge maybe not bleeding edge anymore, but like it's a newer tech, it's a newer type of game. And I don't know what your experience with it is, but I feel like there's a lot of games that also, on top of the social aspect, help to promote like real legitimate, not just like hand-eye coordination with a controller, but hand-eye coordination with your physical hands and seeing different objects, um, and interacting with worlds and being able to physically interact with an avatar of another person and things like that. Excuse me. How do you feel about like that kind of bringing people together and like the effect that that can have on someone's development and hand-eye coordination and physical fitness?
I mean, I think that could absolutely be used effectively too, right? Like, I think by and large, we learn better through our experiences. Like when we have a lived experience of something, when we're our action and our, there's an action plus our mental component to it. I just think it kind of sticks in us a little bit more. So, I mean, virtual reality, I mean, I know like just in terms of even from a therapy process, like when you can have people perform an action in the company of, let's say, a therapist, whether that's like getting over certain anxiety provoking things, like the experience is just much more profound and meaningful. So virtual reality, I think, like whether it's from a game perspective, whether it's from a therapeutic perspective, I think it kind of simulates real life in a way that might really lead to like just more effective learning.
Yeah. No, I'm a huge proponent of video games and the beneficial aspect that they can have on one's life, as long as they're not abused, as long as you actually get out into the world, which I'm guilty of spending 10 hours in front of a screen when I get a new game.
Yeah.
Um, uh,
But the perspective on video games has to change, and not just video games, like TV too. Like, I mean, I have a professor I work with at school, and she has shown that, like, if you use effective, even television programs or certain characters on a TV show, like they can help it into like a child learn better. Like you can learn maybe math skills through TV. So it's not just like we can't just demonize video games and too much TV as a problem. I think it's also the content and what people consume. And I think like if we're able to use that as like a learning tool, it's almost like, I don't know, it's a way of reaching kids in a different avenue that they're more like likely to kind of again consume and learn from.
mhm. How do you encourage kids to like get out into the world too and like interact with each other face to face? Like when you have, let's say you've got, for example, someone who doesn't really want to interact with people or is struggling socially, how do you break through barriers like that?
It's hard with kids though, because like in many respects, it's what's the incentive too. You want them to have like agency in terms of like you want to empower them to make their own decisions and be what depending on their age and maturity level. But you have to explore like what are those barriers attributed to? I mean, is there an anxiety component? Is this individual just shy? Does this individual not have friends? So it's kind of hard to like, I mean, you can't convince somebody to do something if they don't feel that there's buy-in for them. So this is where
Mhm.
like, again, there's a therapeutic approach that's called motivational interviewing. You have to kind of you have to try to enhance motivation and try to connect with this individual to like feel that there's some relevancy to doing this. Because again, like you're not going to convince somebody to just get out there in the world if they don't see there's any benefit. And it might be harder with kids because some kids, they're maybe more emotional. Maybe they can't handle certain feelings of anxiety the same way as an adult, let's say. And that's where you kind of have to incorporate the parents, because the parents could either enable a behavior or they can encourage another one. So sometimes the parents have to be involved with that.
So how do you motivate? How do you get the buy-in? How do you, even if it's not with a kid, even if it's with someone who's, let's say, our age, how do you get buy-in to help them get out of their own way in certain situations?
We got to get somebody to acknowledge that there's like an issue in the first place. Like when you say get out of their own way, I mean, maybe we see it, I see it, you see it, but they might see it much differently. And so a lot of it has to do with perspectives, and what one wants. Because there has to be that meeting point. Because if I'm just telling somebody what they should do or how they could be more effective, the advice might be sound. But if I'm coming from a place where there's no kind of relationship or trust, they're just gonna they're just gonna disregard what I said. So it varies by the individual, but you really have to kind of create. There's different ways of doing it, but you have to kind of create an incentive in terms of the person acknowledging that there's a problem, and the person acknowledging that they want to see, kind of establishing a goal more or less. Because people's behavior exists for a reason. People do certain things because they're getting something out of it, whether they're conscious of it or subconscious. Like, we do things because it works for us on some level. Even bad things like conflict might still work for somebody on some level. So you have to explore those things.
With conflict, how?
From just like using drugs, for instance. Like, I mean,
Okay.
we would all acknowledge that drugs have bad consequences, but if somebody's dealing with like depression and it numbs certain emotions, if it just, again, certain drugs obviously increase in like feelings of dopamine and serotonin. So there is a payoff. And even somebody like, let's say, that's argumentative, or maybe has like anger issues. Like, some people seek attention through negative means. They call them negative attention seeking behaviors. Is a kid acting out because they're acting out for a reason? Are they acting out because that's how they get responded to, or that's how they get heard from others? So the kid might not even be aware of this, but maybe this, adolescent is like, when I act out, all of a sudden I have a teacher that gives me attention. I have the guidance counselor. My mom gives me attention.
Oh, interesting.
Yes. So there is a payoff. There's something
Right.
that's driving behavior.
I actually didn't even think of it in those terms, that like you could be getting the same payoff as someone acting in what we would consider like a positive way, because you're getting the attention, you're getting the things that you're looking for. You just may have you found like the dark side of the route to get there, almost.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Or dark side, or it's like it's the way that they know how. Like, it's maybe the way they've been reinforced. I mean, I hate to say it, I see a lot of students with like learning disabilities that maybe they go under the radar. Maybe teachers they like really struggle in school, and maybe they're not adequately diagnosed. So they already can't learn maybe in the same way. They struggle in class. So how do you kind of make connections with others? Some kids like act out, or they're like the class clown, or maybe they do like, so they find different ways, because I think on some level, a lot of youth, they do want to, we are mammals at the end of the day. We do want to achieve, like, we want connection points with people. Like, we have neurochemicals like oxytocin, like we have things that come when we're with others, by and large. So yeah, I think like youth in particular, whether it's acting out or not, there is something that they're getting out of it. It could be avoidance. It could be to make connections. You have to explore why people do the things they do.
How do you explore that? Like, where do you even begin? Like, I'm hearing all of these things and I'm like, okay, I want to talk more about that. I want to talk more about that. I really want to know more about this or that. How do you as a professional really decide where to start?
Yeah. I mean, you kind of have to hone in on what's most problematic and most pressing to the individual, because, I mean, they're seeking help, or a parent is seeking help for their child for a reason. There is something overt that is creating conflict or a problematic situation. So that's kind of where you start. But what you tend to uncover is that there might be other factors, there might be other behaviors that are worth paying attention to. It's usually not like a singular thing. It's usually that one thing might be representative of a bigger issue. But by and large, like, again, it kind of has to start with the individual, like we call it like a person-centered approach. Like, you kind of have to let, in some respects, especially early on, the individual kind of guide treatment. It also depends where you're at. If I'm working for like an agency that's related to substance abuse, that you kind of know where you're starting, right? With the substance. But like in private practice, it's kind of, it really varies, and it's ultimately what the individual feels is most relevant.
So when you're doing that and you're letting them kind of guide things, what techniques do you have that allow you to recognize, okay, this is a relevant point, this is a relevant point, let's dig more into that? Like, are there cues that you look for that help steer the conversation, to help them kind of almost like the inception concept of like figure out things for themselves, where you're kind of guiding them to it? Are there particular things that you look for?
Yeah, early on though, I would say it's more like kind of understanding patterns, learning from that. Because again, a singular behavior doesn't really tell us much, but patterns of behavior are instrumental, and they kind of inform you more. So I pay attention to sources of conflict, symptoms, like really what the symptoms are, what that person perceives as a difficulty for themselves. And then I just try to explore what are triggers, what are the cues for it, when it comes up, how often, how intense, how long
Mm-hmm.
certain things last. So again, it's all about like kind of pattern understand. Like you're almost trying to just accrue information related to patterns, because ultimately with us as humans, like I think we do establish routines, good and bad. So
Sure.
through those routines and through those patterns of behavior, you kind of can uncover where treatment needs to kind of go towards.
Okay. That makes sense. So now we've been going for a little over an hour now, and I'm sure you
Oh,
probably want to spend a little bit of time with your family today.
oh
But
yeah.
what's something that, like, if people have gotten to this point in the podcast, and what's something that you really want everybody to be able to take away from the world of psychology?
Oh, that's like a tough one.
I
I
know
guess.
that's a tough one, right? But I feel like you're better equipped than I am to be able to say, this is the most important thing that we talked about, or, you know, I really, given the sensitivity of the topic, I would love for, if someone listens to this, to be able to say that it helped them in some way,
Sure.
or, something like that, where it brings positivity to someone's life. So I'm curious as to what you feel is the most important thing that someone should take away from all of the different topics that we talked about.
Well, for me, there's like a school of therapy that really I try to incorporate in my own life, and it kind of comes from a theory called acceptance and commitment therapy, and like ACT. And the big part about that is just in terms of one's emotions. I guess it's like we really have to just pay attention to how we feel when we feel it, and we have to accept certain things versus fight certain emotions. Like we have a way of labeling things as like this is a good feeling, this is a bad feeling, but they're feelings. And I think in some respect we can be too reactive because of certain feelings. Like if we're sad, if we're anxious, if we're angry, we tend to be a little too reactive and we almost act in an automatic way. So in a way, like, could we accept a feeling for what it is? It's an emotion. It's biological. There's things going on in our brain. There's neurochemicals being released. By and large, emotions dissipate, and we tend to kind of return to a baseline. But in that emotional time, could we be okay being anxious? Could we be okay feeling anger? Because I think like if we can accept certain emotions, then we could pay more attention to how we behave. Because what we really can control, we can't control what we feel. Sometimes what we feel comes unpredictably, but we do always choose behavior and action. And I just think like if we have a different, better sort of relationship with our feelings, we might be able to choose a more desirable action that results in less consequences, and might lead to just, I don't know, just better outcomes. So I don't know. I just wish that we can have a different relationship with our emotions and pay more attention to, despite how I feel, I could still choose how I behave. And if we choose how we
I
act,
really like that.
yeah, and if we
I
choose how,
like that a lot.
yeah, in a more like conscious way, I just think a lot of issues might be like avoided. I don't know. I just think paying attention to that matters.
No, I think that that's incredibly powerful. And I think that's a great message. And at some point, I would like to talk more about that, because I think that we could all benefit from having more of that in our life.
Hmm.
Um, and I just want to say thank you for taking an hour or so out of your night for me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, no worries, Frank. Thanks for finding this interesting enough to talk to me about. And if
Oh,
there's
of
ever any
course.
help you need down the road, let me know because I can
Oh,
speak for hours.
for sure. And I'm hoping to get some more time with you, hopefully
Yeah,
next time in person.
sure, absolutely. That sounds good.